Okay, guys, this is going to be a continuation to my last video on the remembrances of my early childhood. Okay, so this is a continuation to my last writing. I was going to add it to the end of my childhood remembrances video, but that ended up being much longer and more detailed than I expected, as when I was writing, things were coming back to me, and I wanted to be detailed as possible because, like I said, I've been trying to access these memories for quite some time now and didn't want to miss the opportunity to get as many details out as I could. So I begin this with only a handful of points I want to make in regards to the weird family dynamics that surround me. We shall see what details come up in this process. I had mentioned how my mom and her sister, who are about a year apart in age, both had kids at the same time. My female cousin being 2 weeks younger than me, and my male cousin being about 6 months older than my brother, who is 2.5 years younger than me. So if that makes sense, they had 4 of us within 2.5 years. My mom was 19 when she had me. Then when I was about 4 is when my aunt hooked up with the wealthy guy she is still with to this day. They are now billionaires. My mom, approximately a year later, after my aunt hooked up with the rich guy, hooked up with my stepdad, who was about 10 years older. My step-uncle was about 10 years older than them too. And they had actually known each other as kids. My stepdad being the youngest of 13 from Massachusetts and a street kid. He had traveled around and was big in, all over the United States, to California and stuff. And he was big into martial arts and even having claimed to have been a student of Chuck Norris for a short period of time. I mentioned how my 2 cousins and me and my brother were very close the first few years of our lives. Like, we were inseparable. I mean, we were extremely close. And that even once my aunt had remarried and my mom remarried, things, at least from my kid perspective, seemed fine until my aunt and uncle had come up one evening to the cabin, and my mom and stepdad were witnessing to them about Jesus and how the music industry was demonic. Upon my aunt and uncle leaving that evening, those familial ties were broken and things were never the same. I have also mentioned in prior videos how my aunt only came to the cabin to visit maybe once every other year for a total of, let's say, 4 times. She would only stay. Now, I will mention we did go to my aunt's house. My mom would take us over there maybe, a couple times a year, maybe 3 times a year to visit for the day. To go swimming, and we would be able to see how luxurious, extremely wealthy people live. She would only stay so when my aunt would come and visit those few times up at the cabin, she would only stay for a couple hours and usually bring food and other gifts. The most memorable of these times was when she had came back from a trip to some island paradise and was bragging how she had just bought a pair of earrings for, I can't remember, between $10,000 to $15,000. And within an hour later had gone down to the ocean and a wave hit her and pulled her earrings out to the sea. And she just laughed about it like it was nothing, While we were living in my grandfather's old hunting cabin, mind you, on a mountain in Front Royal with just the necessities for survival. She would brag about how she would hang out with Aerosmith and Bill Cosby was a good friend of hers and have pictures. And back then I thought those stories were amazing and I saw no harm in them. The only thing I knew at the time was when my aunt would leave, my mom would turn into an emotional wreck, and it never was good for me. Now, looking back, I see my aunt was a complete sociopath who cared only of her own status and exuberance and got off by coming to her poor sister's shack in the woods to rub all her vanity and riches in my mom's face. An extremely abusive and disgusting thing to do. Now, the abuse didn't end there, as my mom and her sister... Stiff. Now, the abuse didn't end there, as my mom and her sister were constantly vying for my grandmother's attention and acceptance as well. My aunt clearly won that battle, as my grandmother's creed in life is short, be happy. and it was obviously easier to live by that creed as a jet-setting millionaire than as a pauper in the woods. Which opens the door to speak on my grandma. Now, she worked for the Washington Post for, I believe, a couple decades, though I could be wrong. As an editor, I believe, but again, I could be wrong. Her details are wishy-washy in my head, but I do know she had dated some high-profile people. The only one I can remember now was Zig Ziglar. I think the name was just easy to recall. But I think, and I think he signed a Frisbee. I think I had a Frisbee as a kid that he had signed. But I think he was some kind of sports star or motivational speaker. This is really all the details I can give on her at this moment. But again, I think there is much more to her that adds to the generational trauma and abuse. What I get a feeling about her is her relationship with her mom and the dynamic with her sister. I think my grandma had one sister. But I don't want to start guessing at things, so I will leave that for now. I would like to add my grandma is extremely a passive-aggressive woman. She is not even 5 foot tall and comes off as so innocent, but she clearly has an underlying survival instinct. I would say my grandmother is in good health to this day and is in her early to mid-80s. Now, my grandmother's husband, who she bore 3 kids with, and this is, way prior to when I was a kid in my remembrance of her when she was working at the Washington Post and got with Zig Ziglar and all that stuff. Her and my grandfather were married for a short amount of time, I guess for a few years, just long enough to have my mom, my aunt, and my uncle. My uncle being the youngest. But getting back to my grandpa, this man was a character. He retired out of the Navy as a high-ranking official in the Pentagon. He had owned several different small businesses and was a hustler by heart. He had a used car lot in the area of Raleigh, North Carolina, where we went for a few summers vacations when I was a kid to visit, but I think the man would sell anything for a profit. Yeah, he was definitely a hustler. He was loud and proud. Before heading to church on Sunday morning, he would declare out loud, telling my mom, "We have to leave early, honey." He had a real southern accent. "We have to leave early, honey. I have to go check on my nigger." This being the man who ran his business for him while he enjoyed the returns. Overall, I enjoyed my grandfather as he was like something out of a book more so than a real-life person. He had an ego as big as he was, and you always knew when he was in the room. The last I heard a couple years ago, he was suffering from Alzheimer's, dementia, and in his mid to late 80s. Now, my grandparents on my dad's side, they were both Marines, I believe, both retired out of the military. They were much older. My granddad on my dad's side was also a retired high-ranking official out of the Pentagon. My grandma didn't like my mom and vice versa. My granddad used to sit us on his lap, and I remember him telling us stories of the war. Now, I know he fought in Korea, but I believe he might have also fought in World War II. The most memorable story he ever told was when the enemy would throw a grenade. They would be up on a hill on a mountainside, and the enemy would throw a grenade, and they would pick it up and chuck it back. That always stuck with me, a bunch of adults playing hot potato with a stick of dynamite. I found it fascinating. He passed in the early to mid 1990s, and my grandma about a decade after that. And they were much, much older than my mom's parents. When my grandfather passed in the mid 90s, I think he was in his late 70s or maybe even early 80s, possibly. So yeah, he fought Korean War and I believe World War II as well, and retired high-ranking official out of the Pentagon. So in conclusion, I find it very strange the type of life my grandma on my mom's side had, running in those circles, both known and unknown, that she was entangled in with certain celebrities and working at the Washington Post. And then also to have both my grandfathers retire as high-ranking officials in the Pentagon. Both of these families residing in Northern Virginia, just a stone's throw from Washington, D.C. which leads into my aunt and her whole dynamic. I don't like going into these people. The only reason I'm mentioning them is because they are tangled in with my healing. There is something else going on. I don't know if somebody in my family sold, maybe whoever got rich in my family sold the poor side of my family out through some kind of ritual, or for wealth and fame. I don't know how all that works, because I've never seen it firsthand, but I've heard plenty of stories of how it works, and it just makes sense. For my aunt to be able to land this guy, it just out of the blue, supposedly meeting in a bar, does not make any sense whatsoever. Okay, this leads me to my aunt and her whole dynamic. Again, her and my mom were extremely close in age and had kids at the same time at a young age. The four of us within 2.5 years. These kids being very close in age, and both of them vying for their mother's attention. They were only a year apart, and they were both seriously wanted their mother's attention so badly for some reason. My aunt marrying this extremely wealthy man. Now, a word on my uncle, he did not acquire his own wealth, but it was his father who had established the business, and by the time we came into his life, had already turned it into an extraordinarily wealthy and successful company. They had acquired so much wealth that by the time we had come into the picture in the early 80s, the old man, my uncle's father, had purchased and been living in the Mars estate in Middleburg, Virginia. Yes, the Mars estate. I remember, Mars M&M Company. I remember going to visit at a very young age and not even being able to comprehend that kind of wealth. The mansion was quite something. The coolest thing being upstairs, there was a secret elevator shaft that led to a secret room and extra hallways. This being because the old lady Mars feared the house was haunted and would hide within the walls at night. At least that is what we were told, which I think I verified that story later on in life. I can't remember exactly. I'm sure you guys can do research and find out if you're really concerned about it. Either way, it was the coolest thing to see the secret passageways and imagine an old lady hiding from ghosts in them. So just to give you an idea of the type of wealth I speak of, my uncle had one sister, I believe. My uncle also had one daughter from a previous marriage before my aunt, and this being my cousin by marriage. She was about 5 years older than me. She was a beautiful girl. I had a crush on her as a young kid. She was absolutely gorgeous. She ended up being a Playboy playmate. I believe it was in the early 2000s. Now, my aunt had another daughter who I used to babysit at a young age. I think she was about 10 years younger than me. Her nickname for me was Goofy. Again, that was my nickname. As a kid, I put that mask on. Again, going back to the extreme masking I would perform to hide my abuse and trauma. Anyways, that girl ended up marrying one of the Bush brothers that raced for NASCAR. I mention these things because it doesn't just happen by chance that one sister marries a billionaire and lives like a queen while the other lives a life of poverty, especially when they were extremely close growing up and into their early adulthood, going so far as to have their first 2 children extremely close in age, and multiple other coincidences. There are no coincidences. You add in the factor of both sides of the family having high-ranking officials in the Pentagon, and then these strange missing moments in my childhood, plus the obvious abuse. There is more to this than I have finished putting together, but I am putting it together.